When you complain about your Monday morning commute or your demanding boss, consider this. Every single aspect of your working life would seem like paradise to someone from medieval Europe. The alarm clock that wakes you, the coffee that energizes you, the heated office that protects you, these conveniences didn't exist for the 90% of medieval people who spent their entire lives bound to backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. Medieval work wasn't just difficult, it was a grinding, relentless system that consumed human bodies and spirits with mechanical efficiency. Unlike today's complaints about work-life balance, medieval laborers had no concept of leisure time, vacation days, or retirement. Work was survival, and survival was work. The feudal system created a hierarchy of labor that trapped millions in cycles of exhausting physical demands, dangerous conditions, and economic desperation that would horrify modern workers accustomed to basic rights and protections. The reality of medieval working conditions reveals a world where occupational hazards weren't regulated away, they were simply accepted as the inevitable cost of staying alive. From the manor fields to the urban workshops, medieval people endured working environments that modern safety inspectors would immediately condemn. But understanding these conditions isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about recognizing how profoundly our relationship with work has transformed over the centuries. The medieval peasant's working day began in complete darkness, hours before what we would consider a reasonable start time. Agricultural work dictated that laborers rise at 4 in the morning during harvest season, stumbling through pitch-black cottages to begin their endless cycle of tasks. Without electric lighting, peasants worked by candlelight made from animal fat, a luxury many couldn't afford, or simply felt their way through morning chores in total darkness. The first task involved feeding livestock in freezing barns where breath turned to frost and fingers went numb within minutes. Medieval peasants wore thin woolen clothing that provided minimal warmth against the damp chill of English mornings or the bitter cold of northern European winters. Their hands, already cracked and bleeding from previous days' labor, would split further in the cold as they handled rough wooden tools and hauled heavy buckets of water from wells that frequently froze solid. By the time the sun appeared, peasants had already completed what modern workers would consider a full morning's effort. They had milked cows, fed chickens, chopped firewood, and prepared simple meals of bread and thin porridge. The actual fieldwork, plowing, planting, weeding, or harvesting, hadn't even begun, but the pre-dawn hours were only preparation for the brutal physical demands that would consume the next 12 to 14 hours of their lives. Medieval agricultural work required physical strength that most modern people cannot comprehend. Peasants pushed heavy wooden plows through fields of hard-packed earth without the benefit of modern machinery or even adequate nutrition to fuel their efforts. The moldboard plow, introduced in the later medieval period, was considered a technological advancement, but it still required enormous human effort to operate effectively. A single peasant might spend 8 hours behind a plow, their shoulders and back bearing the constant strain of guiding the implement through rocky, root-filled soil. Their hands developed permanent calluses and deformities from gripping wooden handles that splintered and wore rough grooves into their palms. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletons reveals consistent patterns of bone stress, joint deterioration, and spinal compression that resulted directly from decades of this repetitive physical labor. During harvest season, peasants bent over grain stalks for entire days, cutting wheat and barley with hand sickles in a stooped position that modern ergonomics experts would recognize as guaranteed to cause permanent back injury. The repetitive motion of swinging the sickle, combined with the bent posture required to gather grain efficiently, created chronic pain that medieval people simply accepted as an unavoidable part of life. Women worked alongside men in the fields, often while pregnant or nursing infants, adding additional physical stress to bodies already pushed beyond reasonable limits. But the physical demands were only part of the challenge facing medieval agricultural workers. Medieval peasants worked not for money, but for the right to survive on someone else's land. The feudal system bound peasants to their lord's estate, where they performed unpaid labor in exchange for small plots of land they could farm for their own subsistence. This arrangement, known as villenage, meant that peasants could spend 3 days each week working their lord's fields without receiving any compensation except permission to work their own small plots on the remaining days. The economic reality was stark. Peasants produced wealth they could never access. They grew wheat that was processed into white bread for noble tables, while they subsisted on coarse barley bread mixed with beans, chickpeas, and whatever vegetation they could forage. During good years, peasant families might enjoy adequate nutrition. During bad years, which occurred frequently due to weather, disease, or warfare, they faced genuine starvation while continuing to perform the same exhausting physical labor. Medieval records from English manors document peasants who owned nothing beyond their basic tools and a few pieces of rough clothing. Their cottages belonged to the Lord, their livestock belonged to the Lord, and even their children's future labor belonged to the Lord through hereditary bondage. A peasant who became too old or injured to work effectively faced destitution with no social safety net beyond the minimal charity provided by local churches. The contrast with modern employment becomes even more striking when examining the legal restrictions that govern peasant labor. Medieval peasants couldn't simply quit their jobs and find better opportunities elsewhere. Legal documents from the period reveal a system of bondage that tied peasants to specific estates for their entire lives. Villains required their lord's permission to leave the manor, to marry, or even to send their children to learn trades in other locations. This legal bondage created a captive workforce that had no leverage to demand better working conditions or fair compensation. The manor court system enforced these restrictions through a combination of fines, punishment, and social pressure. Peasants who attempted to leave without permission faced capture and forced return to their original estates. Medieval legal records document cases of lords pursuing runaway peasants across multiple counties, treating them as stolen property rather than free individuals seeking better opportunities. Even peasants who technically held free status found their mobility severely restricted by economic reality. Without savings, education, or connections beyond their local area, free peasants often remained trapped in cycles of agricultural labor that differed little from the conditions faced by legally bound villains. The guild system in medieval towns created additional barriers to economic mobility, requiring expensive apprenticeships and formal membership that excluded most rural laborers from urban opportunities. Marriage laws further restricted peasant mobility by requiring lords' permission for unions that might remove valuable workers from the estate. Young peasant women faced a double burden of agricultural labor combined with restricted choices about their personal relationships and family formation. Medieval urban workers faced different but equally challenging conditions in workshops and early manufacturing centers. Craftsmen worked in small, dark buildings with minimal ventilation, breathing air thick with dust, smoke, and chemical fumes from their trades. Blacksmiths inhaled metal particles and smoke from coal fires that burned constantly in their workshops. Tanners worked with animal hides using chemicals that produced toxic vapors and required handling materials that would require hazardous waste procedures in modern facilities. The guild system that governed urban crafts created rigid hierarchies that trapped most workers in permanent subordinate positions. Apprentices, typically children between 7 and 14 years old, worked without wages for 7 years while learning their trades. During this period, they lived in their master's household, performing domestic labor in addition to craft work, and faced physical punishment for mistakes or perceived laziness. Journeymen who completed their apprenticeships found themselves in an economic bind that prevented most from ever achieving master status. The guild system required journeymen to produce a masterpiece demonstrating their skills, but they also needed substantial capital to establish their own workshops and gain guild membership. Most journeymen remained wage laborers for their entire careers, working in other men's shops without the prospect of economic advancement or independence. Urban workshops operated from dawn to dusk, with workers laboring by candlelight during winter months when daylight hours were insufficient for completing daily production quotas. A combination of poor lighting, dangerous tools, and tired workers created accident rates that would shock modern safety professionals. Medieval workers used tools that were primitive, dangerous, and poorly maintained by modern standards. Agricultural implements were made entirely of wood and iron, with sharp edges that required constant sharpening and handling techniques that regularly resulted in serious injuries. Scythes used for cutting grain had long, curved blades that could easily slice through muscle and bone if workers lost their footing or misjudged their swing. Carpentry and construction work involved heavy timber handling without modern lifting equipment or safety protocols. Medieval builders constructed elaborate cathedrals and castles used rope, pulley systems, and human muscle power to move massive stone blocks hundreds of feet into the air. Construction accidents were so common that medieval chronicles rarely bothered to record individual incidents unless they involved particularly spectacular collapses or multiple fatalities. Metalworking required handling red-hot iron and steel with minimal protective equipment. Blacksmiths wore leather aprons that provided limited protection against flying sparks and molten metal splashes. Their workshops lacked modern ventilation systems, forcing workers to breathe smoke and metal fumes that caused respiratory problems and shortened lifespans measurably compared to other medieval occupations. Women's work tools were equally hazardous in different ways. Spinning wheels and looms could catch loose clothing or hair, causing serious injuries. Cooking over open fires required constant attention to prevent burns from hot coals, boiling liquids, and uncontrolled flames. The combination of loose medieval clothing and open flames created fire hazards that killed thousands of women annually in domestic accidents. But even these physical dangers paled compared to the environmental hazards that medieval workers faced daily. Medieval workshops and living spaces had air quality that would immediately trigger modern environmental health warnings. Urban areas filled with smoke from countless wood and coal fires, creating a permanent haze that reduced visibility and coated everything with a layer of soot and ash. Workers in metal trades breathed air containing lead particles, sulfur compounds, and other toxic substances that accumulated in their bodies over decades of exposure. Textile workers inhaled cotton and wool fibers that caused respiratory diseases similar to modern black lung conditions. Medieval medical texts described symptoms consistent with occupational lung diseases, but workers had no choice but to continue their trades despite developing chronic coughs, breathing difficulties, and chest pain that worsened progressively over time. Indoor air quality was particularly problematic during winter months when workers sealed buildings against cold weather. Workshops and homes filled with smoke from inefficient fireplaces and oil lamps, creating carbon monoxide levels that would be considered immediately dangerous by modern standards. The combination of poor ventilation and multiple open flames created an atmosphere that was simultaneously toxic and explosive. Rural workers faced different but equally serious air quality issues. Grain processing created dust clouds that filled barns and mills with particles that caused chronic respiratory irritation. Threshing grain with flails in enclosed spaces produced dust concentrations that made breathing difficult and left workers with persistent coughs that lasted throughout harvest season. Medieval workers had no concept of weekend leisure or annual vacations. The agricultural calendar dictated work schedules, with brief respites only during the darkest winter months when field work became impossible. Even during these periods, peasants continued daily chores of animal care, equipment maintenance, and household production that kept them busy from dawn to dusk. Religious holidays provided the only interruption to constant labor, but these breaks were irregular and often coincided with additional community obligations. Medieval church records indicate that peasants typically worked between 250 and 300 days per year, with rest days occurring primarily during major Christian festivals that required church attendance and community participation rather than genuine leisure. The concept of retirement was unknown to medieval workers. Peasants continued working until physical incapacity made labor impossible, at which point they became dependent on family members or faced destitution. Medieval legal documents describe elderly peasants who transferred their landholdings to adult children in exchange for promises of food and shelter during their remaining years. Urban craftsmen faced similar prospects, with guild regulations requiring masters to support disabled or elderly workers, but these obligations were often inadequately fulfilled. Medieval city records document numerous cases of former workers who ended their lives in poverty despite decades of productive labor that generated wealth for employers and guild masters. Workers who suffered job-related injuries faced medical treatment that often worsened their conditions rather than providing healing. The prevailing medical theory of the four humors led to treatments that were not only ineffective but actively harmful to recovery from traumatic injuries and occupational diseases. Physicians and barber surgeons treated workplace injuries with techniques like bloodletting, which weakened patients who were already suffering from trauma and blood loss. Burns from metalworking accidents were treated with applications of boiling oil heated irons, procedures that increased tissue damage and infection risk dramatically. Broken bones were set without proper alignment or stabilization, leading to permanent deformities that made return to physical labor impossible. Occupational diseases were completely misunderstood by medieval medical practitioners. Respiratory problems from dust and smoke exposure were attributed to imbalances in bodily humors rather than environmental causes. Treatment involved purging, bleeding, and administration of herbal remedies that had no effect on the underlying lung damage caused by years of toxic exposure. The absence of antiseptic procedures meant that even minor workplace cuts and abrasions frequently became infected, leading to amputations or death from sepsis. Medieval workers learned to treat injuries with folk remedies that sometimes helped but often made conditions worse through the introduction of additional bacteria and foreign substances into wounds. Medieval society's rigid class structure meant that working conditions varied dramatically based on social status, but even the most privileged workers faced challenges that would be unacceptable by modern standards. Skilled craftsmen and guild masters worked in better conditions than agricultural peasants, but they still faced occupational hazards, long hours, and economic insecurity that modern workers would find intolerable. Apprentices and servants occupied the bottom of the urban working hierarchy, facing exploitation that combined the worst aspects of child labor with complete legal powerlessness. Master craftsmen could physically punish apprentices for real or perceived failures, and these young workers had no recourse to legal or social institutions that might protect their interests. Women workers faced additional challenges based on gender restrictions that limited their access to higher-paying trades while subjecting them to the same physical demands and occupational hazards as male workers. Medieval records document women performing heavy agricultural work, textile production, and domestic service under conditions that combined workplace exploitation with social and legal discrimination. Even relatively privileged workers like scribes and clerks worked in conditions that modern office workers would consider unacceptable. Medieval writing required hours of precise handwork in poorly lit conditions that strained eyesight and caused repetitive stress injuries. Scribes developed permanent hand deformities from gripping quill pens and suffered from chronic back and neck pain from hunching over manuscripts for extended periods. Medieval workers remained trapped in terrible working conditions because economic alternatives simply didn't exist. The feudal system concentrated land ownership in the hands of a small noble class, while the guild system restricted access to skilled trades through expensive apprenticeships and membership requirements that excluded most workers from economic advancement opportunities. Credit and banking systems were primitive and largely unavailable to working-class people, making it impossible to accumulate capital for business ventures or economic mobility. Workers who saved money faced constant risk of theft, warfare, or economic disruption that could wipe out years of careful accumulation in a matter of days. Geographic mobility was severely restricted by legal obligations, lack of transportation, and absence of communication networks that might inform workers about opportunities in distant locations. A peasant bound to a manor in rural England had no way to learn about potentially better conditions in France or Germany, and even if such information were available, the cost and risks of long-distance travel made relocation impossible for most workers. The absence of social safety nets meant that workers who took risks by leaving secure but terrible working conditions faced genuine starvation if their gambles failed. Medieval society provided minimal support for people who became unemployed, disabled, or unable to work, creating powerful incentives for workers to accept known hardships rather than risk unknown dangers. The medieval relationship with work reveals a world where human labor was consumed without regard for worker welfare, safety, or dignity. Every aspect of medieval working life, from the physical demands to the legal restrictions, from the occupational hazards to the economic exploitation, demonstrates how profoundly our modern understanding of work has evolved over the centuries. Medieval workers didn't complain about work-life balance because they had no concept of life separate from work. They didn't demand workplace safety because they had no expectation that work should be safe. They didn't seek career advancement because they understood that their social position was fixed by birth rather than effort or ability. The grinding daily reality of medieval work created a population that was chronically exhausted, frequently injured, and permanently trapped in cycles of subsistence labor that consumed entire lifetimes without offering hope for improvement. When modern workers express frustration with demanding schedules, difficult bosses, or workplace stress, they're exercising freedoms that medieval people couldn't imagine. The freedom to leave, to complain, to seek better opportunities, to retire with dignity. The medieval worker's experience reminds us that our contemporary struggles with work, however real and challenging, occur within a framework of legal protections, economic opportunities and social mobility that represent centuries of hard-won progress away from a world where work was simply another form of bondage that lasted until death.